I've been in rooms where there's 3 or 4 of us saying things. We think we agree, but I don't think we've really agreed. So we need to kind of listen more. We need to lean into more difficult conversations. We need to think longer term, beyond political cycles. I think we do need to collaborate in the truest sense, which means power sharing, which means some people have to give up some power, some organizations, some governments, or we just have to know our place. We don't have to be at every party, we don't have to be invited to every party, but we can still support.
Welcome to the Co-Management Commons podcast. My name is Jamie Snook. I am your podcast host, and I have been working in and with Indigenous communities for over 20 years now. I am joined in this podcast by some of the leading practitioners, researchers, elders, and community members from this sector, where we discuss co-management in Canada with Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. Please check out the show notes, where we always share lots of other resources. And in between episodes, your feedback is always encouraged and appreciated. So thank you very much once again, and take care. I was at a meeting recently. I told you I asked a few people if they knew you, and they all just laughed at me and said that everybody knows you up in Whitehorse.
Yeah, well, it's funny because Kiri and I were talking the other day. We're working on a project together, and then and she's like, "Oh yeah," she's like, "Yeah, I was supposed to talk to you." So, and then my wife heard you present at Yukon U, and she was kind of kicking me. She's like, "Man, why didn't you go to that thing? You would have loved what he was talking about." So we must have some interest in common. So
yeah, no, we definitely do, and that's one of the things that I've been loving about doing this podcast. All of a sudden, is it kind of has been forcing me to connect with others that are in co-management. But I keep saying we don't have like a union or an association or any kind of network really. So I'm hoping through the website I got created there, comanagement.ca, that we can start to, just exchange ideas more. So the podcast has been fun. Like, it's been great for me, great form of professional development too, just learning what everyone else is doing. And I was talking to Sid Canning and another guy, Bruce Bennett, who's also from out that way. They were both there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Carrie, I did do one podcast with her, and she's supposed to track down her dad for me, but I know he's retired, but I am going to still get him eventually because I've known him for a long time.
Yeah, he's elusive. I managed to get him for coffee the other day.
Oh.
And I kind of had a little coffee with him. We've crossed paths many years, like in the Western Arctic and whatnot. And but I didn't. My wife actually worked with him a little bit at parks, but I never worked with him. But anyways, I've known about him, and we both facilitate. So these circles are small, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, do you want to just jump right into this then?
Sure.
And
Let's do it.
Well, just let me say, Dennis, thank you for your time and being willing to come on to the Co-Management Commons podcast. I'm really excited to learn more about you and the work that you're doing with the Yukon Salmon Sub-Committee. And I always like to jump in and start off by learning more about you, because about our positionality is always interesting. So feel free to introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us a bit more about your background. And I should say right off the top, congratulations on your new role as the chairperson of the committee. So congratulations.
Yeah, thanks for that. No, it's a real pleasure to be here and talking about co-management. It's kind of interesting because, even the word co-management, it's, you almost have to remind yourself that's what we're doing. There's so many other words we're using now and so many other places we go with the work we do. So, and I think back in the day, I'll say, co-management was kind of that word that sort of best articulated what we do. But yeah, myself and that positionality, I agree, is really key. So I'm from the south. I'm from BC originally, Lower Mainland, and I moved north. So it'll all be up in north, and then I did my master's research in rural planning in the Western Arctic, and always community planning based. That's the best way to, I guess, rural community planning is kind of the way that I best describe what I have done over the years. And that got me to the Western Arctic, worked for the Inuvialuit. Didn't know what I didn't know, but it was probably the greatest job I had at the time. Well, probably ever. And I was the manager of Inuvialuit tourism. So I would go around and basically do some really amazing, crazy things, fly little planes all over the Western Arctic and test tourism product and build tourism plans and work with all the organizations and hunters and trappers corporations and individuals and communities and yeah, so that was my first job. And then I started getting a little bit into economic development in the Western Arctic, and then moved south to Whitehorse and ended up in Whitehorse. And the beauty of the North is you can reinvent yourself. Always some consistent themes around community and working with multiple stakeholders and governments and groups, and kind of did a couple rounds, a little bit in government of Yukon, did some marketing communications work with some private sector firms. And then I got a job with fish were always something in me, and I don't even really know where it comes from, but fish drew me in, and I was the executive director of the Salmon Sub-Committee. I've done a couple terms now, of which I'm now the chair. So it's been an interesting ride. I also sit on a few different international treaty tables. So I sit on the Pacific Salmon Treaty Transboundary Region panel, which is one of the chapters of the Pacific Salmon Treaty. And then I sit on the Yukon River Salmon Agreement, Yukon River panel table, which is between Alaska and Yukon. So a whole bunch of things in there and interdisciplinary but it's all coming. I think it's all being used as best I can in the work that I'm doing.
Yeah, and am I right in understanding your set up as a consultant too, right? I was intrigued by big fish, little fish. Is there a story behind that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's also about the little fish is important. I mean, those little fish are really important in the ecosystem. We always think of the mega fauna and the mega fish and the big ones. And I like the underdog, and I like to give the little fish profile. And as we know, it's the birds and the bees and the bears and the trees that, salmon support as well. And I like to kind of keep them in mind. And then, yeah, I'm a consultant, facilitator. I've done some conflict conservation transformation work. And yeah, it's I do a lot of salmon planning, a lot of fish planning, but it also translates to caribou sometimes and translates into other species. But yeah, that's kind of a whole spaghetti mess of my professional life. I've got two amazing boys that have grown up in the north and have these big northern identities, one in Inuvik and one in Whitehorse. And yeah, my wife, a lovely family here, and I've been here for over 25 years.
Wow. And the time probably has flown by for you, I would say. It's funny how you can get hooked on the Norse people that come and think it's just going to be for a short while. It can be a lifetime before you before you know it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And with the Yukon Salmon Subcommittee, maybe we could share with listeners a bit about the history and mission of the committee, and just explain the significance of Chapter 16 of the Umbrella Final Agreements. Not everyone's necessarily aware of these co-management arrangements, and I really want to bring more awareness to what it is we do, and stress the importance of implementing the treaties in a good way. So if you could share your insights into this unique committee, it would be really great.
Yeah, great. No, thanks for focusing on this. So the Yukon Salmon Subcommittee is actually the reason we're a subcommittee is we're kind of nested underneath the Yukon Fish and Wildlife Management Board. So it's all Chapter 16. We are autonomous. We do our own thing. They do a few administrative things on our end, but we tend to be we kind of operate on our own to some extent at arm's length. We have representation from a variety of different groups, as laid out in the final agreements, which are modern day treaties. We have, as you know, 11 of 14 settled self-governing First Nations in the Yukon. So our membership is made up of 2 members are nominated from Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada. 2 are nominated from the Fish and Wildlife Management Board. 2 are from the Yukon River drainage, and then 2 from the Alsek and 2 from the Porcupine drainage. Those are our 3 respective salmon drainages. And we're considered the main instrument of salmon management in the Yukon. That's been debated over the years in terms of through some of these implementation reviews and things of that nature. But generally speaking, we tend to have our hands in most things related to salmon. We don't tend to be too technical, although sometimes we dabble that way. We do a lot of engagement outreach, and we make up the majority of the International Treaty Yukon River Panel. So we have that broad, as is probably consistent with co-management, we have representation from a lot of different groups. And, we have harvesters on the table, we have elders, we have technicians, we have biologists, we have bureaucrats, we have a little bit of everything. And that representation is really important as well. Yeah, and we've been around for a while now, and our roles change as the run changes and as the relationship with salmon changes. So yeah, I mean that's a lot of what we're trying to do, and in my tenure now as chair, I've got things that I'd like to see moving forward as well. So we all bring our individual interests and as well.
I can definitely tell with your background that it's a good fit for co-management because it is a lot about facilitating people and points of view and perspectives that can be pretty varied at times, to say the least. And I like your point too about being the primary group making recommendations. We struggle with that sometimes in the East. The co-management board that I work with, we're considered the primary body making recommendations to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans as well. But I think the truth is that there are many people that get the minister's ear and get to have influence. So,
well, it's a really good point. The whole, and the reality is there is one. We're all to some extent competing for attention and resources at this time. We know, especially with salmon, and I should mention that the reason we exist is because salmon were that important, right? And everyone's fish are important, whether it's Atlantic salmon on the East Coast or it's, Pacific down in the Fraser and the lower Fraser or whatnot. But what we find unique is, I mean, we're largely talking about Yukon River Chinook, so we have only a couple species. We have Chinook, chum, some coho, and then in another treaty we have some sockeye as well. And these Chinook in particular, they're big. They're big. They were up to 8 years old. They were huge providers. I mean, these are large fish, 50, 60 pounds, and they travel over 3,000 kilometers. There's about 50 plus communities along the Yukon River. Every fish that flows into Yukon has to pass through Alaska. Sorry, every salmon. So we've got this unique geography, and they hold their value across that entire drainage. So you have the elders at the mouth of the river in Alaska that eat these fish, and they taste like sticks of butter. They're so rich. And then they go 3,000 kilometers. They go to Teslin in the headwaters or in Whitehorse in the headwaters, and they're leaner, a little more dry, and they taste exactly right. So every culture and group is uniquely situated geographically, and has utilized these fish. So salmon are really important, and that's what makes this so hard right now.
what are some of the challenges facing the 3 different species that you referenced there, or maybe a particular one if you wanted to focus on it? But what would you consider the main challenges right now?
Well, I'll focus on the Yukon River Chinook. I mean, they get most of it. So I mean, essentially, all of our salmon runs are down. Well below historical. The Chinook are disastrous. I will say, and it's always important to preface, we do have a few salmon stocks in the Alsek drainage, which is through the Champagne-Ajac First Nation that are still doing okay. Like there is some harvest, there are some opportunities. So I just want to be clear, like when we paint this dire picture, it's not one brush, right? In terms of stress on these fish, I mean, it really is at all life stages. We used to just focus on the management on the harvest lever, right? And that's the one that we tend to spend the most of our time on. And, trying to manage harvest to ensure we get the right number of fish in the spawning grounds, provide people with an opportunity, and it's all about the numbers and fish that are in fish camps or fish caches and whatnot. The biggest issue is the fish aren't coming back. They're low productivity. We're not getting the returns. They're much smaller. The ratios are a little bit off. And of course that's why, right? So that it's a complex life cycle. 3,000 kilometer journey as adults and out migrating as little eggs, little fried, little smolts. So you can imagine the stress. We've got increasing in-river mortality from heat stress that we're finally starting to acknowledge and build into the systems. We've got diseases, parasites. We've got competition out in the ocean. I mean, that's a big one. Is competition with other fish. They're competing with hatchery fish from Russia and Japan, pinks and chums. There's bycatch has been an issue to some extent, less of an extent over the years. And, it really, I think I think there's at least, 80 to 100 documented stressors that are on these fish. So it really is complex, and there's no end to the data one could have or what one could study in order to give you a bit of insight into what is happening and what you can do, right? So that's where a lot of the focus tends to be. But to name one would be very hard. We have one dam on the river. We have one small compensation hatchery. And every run's different. We have different dynamics, but there's just so many different stressors. It's hard to nail down one, but the ocean is looking like a major piece, although the in-river piece with climate change is also becoming bigger.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And I guess with the point about making recommendations, can you talk about some of the more recent ones to the minister, given all of the different challenges that there are? I'd be curious to learn how you approach that through advice to the minister.
Yeah, for sure. So, like I said, in the past, a lot of it was around harvest. So we would make recommendations around harvest. I mean, the way it's written in the final agreements are, the treaty is we have a number of mays and we have a number of shalls. So the mays cover a lot of stuff, right? We may make recommendations on habitat, may make recommendations on this, that, and the other. The one shall we have is that we're mandated to make annual recommendations to the Minister of DFO and to affected Yukon First Nations on allocation to users, and including a recommendation or series of recommendations into the respect to the management of subsistence fisheries. So that's kind of how it reads in the treaty. That gets really interesting because in the past, we would have domestic fisheries, commercial fisheries, recreational fisheries, and then subsistence fisheries. Subsistence being prioritized. And above all of that, we have conservation as a key principle in the treaty. So the reality is right now, there's no domestic fisheries. There's no recreational fisheries. There's no commercial fisheries. There really is no subsistence fisheries right now. And so we're kind of really all focused on conservation. So our recommendations, they're getting very interesting right now, especially because part of the issue when you're sharing a resource with Alaska is you're sharing a resource with Alaska. They have an entirely different management regime, different definitions of subsistence, right? Subsistence in the Canadian context, as you know, through all through case law and everything else that's been settled, is subsistence users have rights, priority rights. In Alaska, you can be someone who's come off a plane from another country, lived in the bush for a year, and you have those subsistence rights. So we deal with a lot of that. I want to just preface, our recommendations in some ways are getting easier because nobody's fishing. That's just the plain and simple part of it, right? Where we're getting into, there's a lot of nuance, and really important nuance is ceremonial, cultural fisheries, trying to keep that fish culture alive. The reality, again, biologically, based on preseason projections, there are so few fish. Every fish needs to get on the spawning grounds, and every egg needs to get in the gravel. So we're bumping up against this really difficult point. So, I don't know what our recommendation is going to be this year, but in years past, we have made a recommendation to the Minister of DFO and Yukon First Nations that there are no fisheries and there is no allocation. Which, as you know, as someone who is a practitioner in this, there is always the Aboriginal right to harvest. So we start getting into communal fisheries versus individual fisheries. Like, it becomes very complex very fast. And every self-governing First Nation, they have their own unique way of managing those fisheries, and that's their right given to them within the treaty. So, we have some First Nations that are saying, we don't want to see a net in the river. We have other First Nations that are saying, we still want to provide some opportunity, say, for freshwater fish in the river, but then there's the risk maybe of a little bit of bycatch. We're purchasing, it's so bad that we're purchasing fish from BC, non-natal fish that we fly into fish camps to keep that culture alive. So, I know I'm not answering your question directly. We have made recommendations on some of the policies that DFOs had. And then, of course, the minister can set aside or vary or accept our recommendations. So, yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now. And actually, you've caught me at a really good time, because our recommendations go in the next 3 weeks. So right now we're doing engagement. We bring it all back, we vet it, we think about it, and then we provide a recommendation. And hopefully it provides the certainty of what people need in order to manage, support their fisheries and their connection to salmon.
I'm curious, when you mention engagement, what that looks like for the subcommittee is, because I was going to ask about the First Nations and their involvement and things like incorporating Indigenous knowledge and so on. So maybe we could talk about that, just share how you do engage with the First Nations in preparation of this advice to the minister.
Sure. No, it's a great question. It's something we think about a lot, and we're constantly changing. There's a lot of different ways to answer that question. We're fortunate that there are some forums that we all get together. Part of it is we've realized that, the divide and conquer, and if DFO's out there, DFO is doing their engagement, Salmon Sub-Committee is doing their engagement, and then we have a new AROM, right, in an Aboriginal Aquatic Resources Ocean Management, if I may have gotten that a little bit wrong, called the Yukon First Nation Salmon Stewardship Alliance. So we have them out there doing work. These First Nation governments only have so much capacity, and their managers and technicians they can only do so much. So we try to work together. So I'll give you one example. We have the Northern Shoshone people in the Yukon make up, they're salmon people. Little Salmon Carmax First Nation, Natronak Dun, and Selkirk First Nation. They've got some big, beautiful rivers that have always held salmon, and that's a lot of the reason why they're there. They have something called the May Gathering, which is an incredible example of a local, culturally relevant way of them getting together, dialoguing around salmon and around fish and wildlife. So we get an invitation from them if they so choose. We don't impose ourselves on that, and we go and talk to them in a way that they want it to be discussed. And they bring in a lot of their traditional law. They have a lot of protocols. We respect those. We try not to be overly technical and just kind of come in and just start jabbering off numbers. And so that's a really good example of the way we engage. We get feedback and we bring that back. Other communities will go directly to. We send out letters to all the governments and renewable resource councils that are listed in the final agreements. And then there's just a whole bunch of work behind the scenes, phone calls. What are you hearing? What do you need? And again, it's getting very complex because we are in that Aboriginal right to harvest space because there are no fish available to harvest. So, we're really, even this morning, we're working on posters that are trying to urge getting every fish on the spawning ground and every egg in the gravel, but also not infringing upon rights. And, I guess we all hope that these stocks will rebuild and, for future generations, and then there will be opportunities to harvest again. But they're simply not biologically the case right now.
So with the right to harvest, is there some level of harvesting happening so people do get to maintain that connection with the fish, or or is it pretty much everybody's on the same page right now?
Everybody's on the same page. And I guess what locks that in and makes it even more interesting is that, and I think I briefly mentioned it, but didn't really explain it, is Department of Fisheries and Oceans and Alaska Department of Fish and Game have signed, those two agencies have signed a 7-year, essentially moratorium on all fisheries. There's still a provision for subsistence if the numbers get high enough, but it's not looking anywhere close to that. So not only do we have, Yukon First Nations have been sacrificing for decades, right? And you always see a decline at the headwaters. You can imagine a 3,000 kilometer run at the headwaters. The Teslin Council and the elders have been talking for decades that these fish are declining. We need to give them a break. And it's gone all the way up. And I will tell you this year, as someone who sat at that table for a while, we had testimony from Yupik Alaskans on the ocean along the coast of the Yukon River that were, the best way to explain it is grief. They were grieving over the loss of those salmon. So everywhere from the headwaters to the mouth, we've seen it. Everyone's in it. We're all in it together. And with these treaties and things and the dialogue, there isn't much or any talk of harvesting. There are always individuals that are going to want to do what they want to do, and then it's up to the First Nation governments to manage those and to use and to support and work with agencies like DFO and ourselves to kind of help educate and that type of thing. So yeah, there's really no harvesting nor room for harvest in the Yukon.
Yeah, no, that is sad and has to be frustrating. And like you mentioned, people have been paying the price for a long time. And I've been really doing a lot of research this year, educating myself on the Bolt decision in Washington State, and it's the 50th anniversary year of that big court decision there. And I just bring this up because in a few of the books that have been newly released this year, there's been a lot of talk about treaties with Canada and Alaska being a state that has been challenging to negotiate with, it sounds like, in the past. And you mentioned treaties there earlier, so I was curious about the subcommittee's involvement in international affairs related to salmon.
Yeah, so we do, as per our final agreement, we make up the majority of the Yukon River Panel, which is an international treaty. It's an annex chapter of the Yukon River Salmon Agreement, or sorry, of the Pacific Salmon Treaty. So we sit at that table. We have a process there. It's quite broad and formal. You were asking earlier about traditional knowledge. I'll just kind of weave in something here, which is quite interesting. So, like I said, I sit on 2 different treaty tables, and ironically, I'm actually a recreational fishery rep sitting on a Pacific Salmon Treaty table for the Transboundary region. I wear a few different hats, but as it relates to the Salmon Sub-Committee and the Yukon River Panel with our Yukon River Chinook, that process has really changed, and it's way different than the formal Pacific Salmon Treaty tables. We have, number one, all the First Nations are provided opportunities to have advisors at the table, so they're privy to all the same dialogue that panel members, officially appointed panel members, have. We've also established something called the Traditional Knowledge Committee. So it literally is a bilateral international traditional knowledge committee where they vet and review projects. They provide testimony. They're trying to really enhance the cultural connection. In some ways, you could say they're trying to decolonize the process. And it's being led by Indigenous people that are representing First Nations at tables that should have the same power as the technical committees on the panel. So, that's a place where we're, part of the argument is, how can we possibly rebuild these runs if we're not working with Alaska? And then you could even scale farther. I'm a bit of a scale junkie, from local to international. And, I like to think of what we're doing locally with our little streams and little tributaries and our little fry releases and our little cleanups, and how they scale up into the international waters. And you can see the lens just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Right now, as we speak, there's a group of Yukon First Nations that are in Alaska and Fairbanks at the Intertribal Fish Commission, which is one of their tribal entities, sharing resources, sharing information. That's happening outside the process. I think that's great. And they're sharing messages of stewardship, of restoration projects, of rights, of all these things. So it'll be really interesting to see how they come back in to the domestic systems. And, I'm not going to lie, it is difficult negotiating at those tables. And, we have had stalemates in the past, and we have overcome them, but it hasn't been easy. So yeah, that international component is really important. But you start asking yourself, how can the Salmon Subcommittee, if we're talking about co-management, if we have domestic obligations as per the final agreements, where and how do we influence internationally, right? If we're talking about high seas fisheries, organizations like the North Pacific Management Councils, that Korea, Russia, Japan, like it's, you can get spread so thin you can't do anything. So we're really trying to think about that right now. At least I am.
You are listening to a special Yukon edition of the Co-Management Commons podcast, supported by Yukon University and UArctic. The podcast is produced by Cloudberry Connections and hosted by Jamie Snook in collaboration with Kiri Staples and David Silas. Enjoy the rest of the conversation, and thank you for caring about Indigenous co-management and honoring our treaties.
It's crazy when you look at the different scales and trying to make sense of all of the different risks that there are to salmon, for sure. And I'm really interested to learn more about the bilateral international traditional knowledge program. That is probably unique in many ways. And are there any examples you could give of where the subcommittee has specifically used Indigenous knowledge to implement a particular policy or change or recommendation? Because I get asked a lot about how to work with Indigenous knowledge to make recommendations or change policy. And any chance I get, I like to ask people of any success stories they've had, because it's not easy, but there are definitely examples where people make it happen.
Yeah, and I would like to think we were it was all woven with traditional knowledge, right? And I'm quite familiar with the various, are some different models for trying to do that, ethical spaces and whatnot. I guess the way that we would support it is, number one, at a very basic level, I would argue that our makeup is very much, we have some elders on our longstanding elders on our committees. They see their role as that, and they bring it in, just through our daily, and they hold us accountable. So that lens is always there at the table. Again, like I said, we have these traditional knowledge committees that we're starting to lean on and kind of empower. The other thing that we do is in the Yukon, a number of First Nation communities, and I've been fortunate to work on a few of these, have community-based salmon plans. And they're driven by First Nation governments. They represent First Nation governments. I think there's about 5 of them in the Yukon right now. And they bring in language, song, story, ceremony, their ways of managing through their traditional laws. And so we do, those are always top of mind and provide priority. I would also argue that the way that our one shall works in terms of our recommendations to the minister, it defers a lot to the First Nations approach. And those First Nation approaches are driven in large part by traditional knowledge. So in a way, it is in there. Could we do a better job? Yes. And I guess I'll share, and this is a personal perspective, and we all bring our own perspectives, life experience, and positionality you mentioned. But I would also argue bias. One of my largest frustrations in salmon management is people's inability to acknowledge their bias. And that is a real frustration for me. I'll admit my bias. I know where it is. And, I want to bring people that are different than me to the table, but I find people do get, if they're in a technical box, they want to count and measure everything, right? And if they're in a different box, they do different things. And where I'm going with this is that, I think what's really important for us right now, us being the collective Yukon salmon community, is to maintain that connection to salmon. So how can we do that? So do we do that through story, song, engagement? We have so many ceremonies. I mean, and I should say this is new, right? I mean, there's always been traditionally First Nation ceremonies. I don't mean to say it that way, but in terms of public ceremonies, we've recognized there's not much we can do. So we need to at least celebrate, share, support, pray. There's just, and so those types of things, or youth camps, fish camps, like harvesting at one time it was fall chum, which we still had. Harvesting other sockeye from BC, harvesting freshwater fish with children, doing youth camps. I mean, all that's part of that tapestry of traditional knowledge and First Nation principles that I think is woven into everything we do. And again, that's my bias, is ensuring that is in there, and not focusing exclusively on the counting and measuring and acquisition of data approach.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I appreciated that the podcast that you shared on CBC there a little while ago. There was some really powerful story in that really captured people's grief, like you mentioned, about the loss of salmon there. So I thought it was really well done and very impactful for sure. And I guess you also mentioned, like, you have some goals now as the chair, and is there anything that you'd like to talk about upcoming projects or initiatives or goals that you'd like to see accomplished over the next little while?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned the 7-year agreement that just came into play April 1st. So that's a pretty big commitment for, Alaska and Yukon and Canada to sign up in the US by default. So we have 7 years essentially now. So what we're trying to do is we're working on a rebuilding plan for Chinook salmon in particular. So we've got a collaborative rebuilding plan, and it's got everybody at the table, and it really is being designed to be collaborative. So we're in the early stages of that. We've had 2 or 3 workshops as a large group. We've had some outside third-party experts that have done this work on the west coast of Vancouver Island, for example, for Chinook. So I think focusing on these rebuilding plans is going to be really important. And what it's doing is it's doing 2 things. It's identifying those priority stressors, right? What are the main stressors on these Chinook? So, and in knowing that, obviously we can try and remedy that to the best extent possible. And there's also this aspect of action while planning. So what can we all agree are important and priorities right now, and how can we move forward together? So I see the Salmon Sub-Committee playing a role in coordinating some of that and participating in that. And I guess from our perspective, like, we've already seen some of these priority actions that the workshops and the groups have come up with. And, we need hope. We need to be working together, moving forward in a direction. And at the end of the day, I'd rather try and be wrong and change course and have it be an iterative approach than waiting until we have certainty in all the data before we start making decisions. I mean, that's kind of what's gotten us into this mess, to be honest with you, to some extent, is, it's this, we need more action, more precaution, more engagement. And I really believe if we don't keep people engaged in these fisheries and they lose hope, we've lost it. So, communications, that outreach, engagement, just having everybody buy into it, our politicians, our public, our, all industry. We've got to get the focus on this. How important are Yukon salmon in the minds and hearts of Yukoners and Canadians? We recognize also we're competing with so many other stocks that are struggling along the West Coast and in the East Coast. So, we just have to make sure that we keep pushing, advocating. So I think the rebuilding plan is a way to bring everybody together, to identify resources, to be strategic, and to start supporting everybody, meeting them where they're at, and keeping salmon in the hearts and minds.
You mentioned earlier about this initiative to fly salmon in from BC. I'd be really curious to hear more about that, because I can draw some parallels of things I've seen happening over here as well. But I don't want to assume what the goals of that project are. Could you share more about that? That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it is quite fascinating, and I'm really glad you're bringing some attention to it. So about, I want to say 15, 20 years ago, the Tezinklikik Council at the headwaters, they just weren't seeing the fish, and they were being very conservation oriented, and they were calling for a moratorium, which, fast forward, 2024, we now have essentially that, in some way that agreement. And, a really interesting thing. So they have their Tlingit, their inland Tlingit brothers and sisters and coastal Tlingit. And they were through the Yukon River Tlingit in BC, they still have some treaty-based fisheries that allow for commercial harvesting. So they were purchasing fish. They were bringing in non-native sockeye without heads and guts into the community. And what's really interesting is you have a whole generation of kids that would be sitting in school, hearing a float plane buzzing and hearing their salmon come. So their salmon came from planes. And, here come the salmon, right? The float plane and in these big totes, they would even fly them out to certain fish camps and they would harvest them there and process them there. And again, what do elders want? They want heads and guts. So there's already, and it's a foreign fish. It tastes different. It's smaller. It dries differently. You can imagine the cultural disconnect to some extent with fish that aren't their fish, right? Or those fish. Anyways, that you can kind of fast forward. And now I would say the vast majority of First Nation governments are flying in fish or trucking in fish from BC. And so, as a necessity, right? So I was involved with a particular First Nation in a distribution last year. They held a salmon day, they did ceremony, they cut fish, they put up fish, and they distributed to all their citizens, filleted, frozen, in bags. And then at least, citizens get some taste of Chinook. It does concern me because we're putting pressure on other stocks. That is of concern. I mean, there are still allocations available and they're, purchased legally and through sometimes Indigenous owned companies or government run companies, but it is the norm to now process BC salmon in the Yukon, which is really, really sad.
So people are still, well, they're obviously getting the salmon to eat, but when you say that they want the head and guts, do you mean are you referring to the experience of cleaning the fish or those actual parts for food as well, type of thing?
100%. They would utilize all the fish and they'd make fish head soup and they'd absolutely, and even things like, I've heard stories on the Teslin River where, they'd throw the guts back in the water and the grayling would feed off them. And so, we're losing these biological processes and you don't see those grayling runs anymore. So what's the connection, right? Just having the whole fish and utilizing it in different ways. And the heads are super tasty.
When you were logging on, I noticed a couple young men with some fishing rods there on the screen. I'm assuming that was your boys, and have they taken up fishing at this stage?
Yeah. Oh, geez. I try not to talk about my kids too much in this venue because it actually gets me quite emotional. As I mentioned, both my kids were born in the north in Whitehorse and Inuvik, and they have this northern identity, as best they can have. And one of the things that, and again, it gets me emotional, it always does, is that if I think of these land claim agreements and I think of, what the way I would define and relate to reconciliation, my kids cutting fish with First Nation elders at First Nation fish culture camps has been probably the single most amazing experience and probably one of my greatest gifts I've given my kids as a father. So, the First Nation governments hold fish camps and they often have culture camps. And because I'm kind of in these circles, if you ask or they open them, like in Dawson, they have one called the First Fish for the Trondaquetchin, and they invite non-Indigenous kids. And, these young kids, they're sitting there with other kids, many of whom have had family fish camps for generations, and they're literally cutting fish and they're putting up fish and they're in it and they're eating it. And, so my kids have been around that. I've got a few funny stories where, my kid needed some volunteer hours for a school project. And so I dropped him off at something called Hakusti'i, which is the inland Tlingit gathering in Carcross. And he was like 16 or something. And I don't know what it is, but I love cutting fish. I've always loved it. My dad's a chef. Well, I know where I got it from. My dad's a chef and he would have sometimes 10, 20 salmon and we cut them. And so it's this deep connection with processing fish. And I taught my boys how to do it. And all good. I dropped my kid off at Hakusti'i and I picked him up in 2 days. He literally had a tent and he hung out and he volunteered. And he was on his own. He was feral, working with this First Nation, just volunteering. And I didn't know what he was going to be doing. I roll in 2 days later to go hang out for a couple of days. And you know what it's like. You're camping and there's smoke and it's just great, right? People everywhere. And I see him coming out of the first aid tent. And I'm like, it had a big cross, the big red cross. And I'm like, and he had his, and I'm, what are you doing? And he's a pretty cool, calm, collected dude. He's like, oh, I'm just cutting fish. And he came out he cut his finger, right? And he had it wrapped up. He said, yeah, they told me to get a Band-Aid because I was bleeding over the fish. And I thought, okay. And literally, he was at a table for hours cutting up totes of these fish, salmon and then I'm looking, there's 3 tables. And I'm like, he is cutting fish with the spokesperson of the Taku River Tlingit. He is cutting fish with an elder from Old Crow. He is cutting fish with I'm like, this is such a beautiful thing, right? So here's my kid. When he must have processed 100 salmon now, at 15, 16 years old. Those are such important, memories for me. So, and my youngest is actually a young filmmaker. So I've got one kid interested in Arctic policy, and he's 22, and I got a 20-year-old interested in filmmaking. And he just did a film of, we have an initiative called the Education Exchange, where we send Yukoners to Alaska and we send Alaskans to Yukon as part of sharing as part of the treaty, right, for salmon. And my son was fortunate enough to go last year. So he made a film. He's now working at our community, at Northwest Tel, at our community cable provider. And he comes across a video that I did 10 years ago when I did the Ed Exchange in Alaska. So it's deep, it's meaningful. And I think, if we can get around salmon are a proxy for a lot of things. And I think if non-Indigenous people and our First Nations, that we can support each other and steward and become advocates, I think that's, again, I just think it's so important. And I, obviously I'm biased, but that's just what I think is really important is us all supporting each other and having a connection to salmon in whatever way, shape, or form that is today.
I really appreciate you sharing that story. You reminded me of my teenage son a couple summers ago, being at a stage with my uncle, and they were cleaning codfish till after midnight with the light on over the stage head, and he just couldn't get enough of it. And I never saw that coming necessarily, of how engaged they would be when we're back in town. He's all about hockey and different sports and stuff, but it was a whole different demeanor and life that came out of him. I felt seeing him there with the fish and cleaning and so on. It was nice to see. I wish I did more of that, frankly, now, and I'm sure he'll probably do more of it in the years to come, I hope. And at the beginning of our chat as well, you kind of made a comment regarding the word co-management. I'm curious to circle back to that a little bit, just in the sense of, you're right, there's a lot of new language and a lot of new advancements on Indigenous rights and so on. And I wonder where things are going in the future, and not wanting us to lose the gains that we've made so far in co-management. I still feel there's a lot more work to do, obviously, but I'd be curious about your thoughts on sort of the state of co-management now in the Yukon, and where you think it's going in the decade ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'll be honest with you. I'll approach it not from an academic perspective, although I do enjoy some of that literature. So from more of a practical, I tried to do a PhD a couple of years ago, and during the COVID times, and it just didn't work for me. So I'll put that academic hat aside and focus on practical. I guess, one of my concerns right now is the pace at which things are declining. Really important species are declining, whether it's caribou. And we've got some success stories too. I don't want to paint this negative brush across everything. Like I said, we have some salmon in the Yukon. They're still doing okay. But the pace of decline with climate change and all the news we're getting, and it's depressing, right? Let's be honest. Shifting baseline, our relationships are changing with a lot of these animals. And, by nature, there's a lot more conflict, right? As I mentioned, I've done some conservation conflict facilitation work, and resolution. And, a lot of that's identity based, right? When we start getting into different groups that see themselves as hunters or fishers or new Canadians or whatever identity piece we have, everyone's trying to have a relationship with a lot of the declining resources. So that does scare me, right? The way I see moose, for example, moose, which is a huge species in the Yukon in terms of providing food and hunting opportunities. We're seeing that all play out in different ways, and you're more than familiar with that type of thing. So that does concern me. I also think that my experience has been that the management systems that we have in place are not precautionary enough, because they're subject to politics, and it's pretty hard to shut things down, have closures, have limitations. So that scares me. And then in the end, we kind of pay for it. So I wish we were like, I would, this is my personal opinion. I'd rather have more certainty and less frequency in the opportunities that I have. So, but anyways, I'm a bit digressing into a bit of a hunting thing there. When I think of co-management, and I think of some of the organizations like the Renewable Resource Councils that are all within our final agreements as well, COVID has been hard. COVID's been really hard. The pace of change has been hard. Rural communities are feeling the pinch right now. You're getting a lot of in-migration into Whitehorse from the communities. First Nation governments are feeling isolated, against some interests like mining or whatnot that are also fragmenting habitat. So all of this is putting a bit of a pressure cooker. And I'm worried that we are seeing some of our co-management bodies feeling like maybe they're not as relevant as they used to be. They don't have the same profile. We also have First Nation governments that are rightfully doing it on their own, and they're moving forward in their own way. And that is also making some of these bodies that have public interests, for example, maybe a little less relevant. So I'm seeing the relevancy, I'm seeing the burnout, I'm seeing demographics shifting where we're not getting diversity on these co-management boards like we used to, or in some ways we used to not have it. Now we've had it, and now I'm worried. Young professionals, they want to work, they need to earn income to pay for a house or a truck, so they can't make a very small honorarium and give up their time away from their families. So there's all these shifts. So I am a little worried that the co-management boards are a little bit burnt out, and they need to maintain relevance. I often think about the Salmon Sub-Committee, and now that I'm chair, we can't sit around and just talk. We just can't. People are tired of it, right? We have to listen more. Let's listen. Let's work. Let's be strategic. Let's demonstrate value. Let's meet people where they're at. It's not about what I think. It's what we've kind of come up with as a group. Let's get over our biases and find common ground. And, I realize I'm kind of all over the place in terms of that answer, but I facilitate a renewable resource annual workshop every year, and it's really hard on these First Nation, these RRCs right now. They're having a hard time filling their nominations. So some of them are running on skeleton. They've got an executive secretary and 2 members, where they should have 8 or 3 members, and that's for a variety of reasons. Part of it's bureaucracy. They can't get things through. Part of it is their community dynamics. They don't have people stepping up. But all of that is impacting. We have new organizations popping up, like these AROMs, that are adding huge value, but they're also fragmenting the conversations, and we can only spend so much time. So yeah, I feel like we are in transition, and governments want to deal government to government. If I'm sitting in a First Nation government and I've got the ear of a minister of a federal Canada, I'm going to go directly there, and I have that ear. And so where do these other RRCs fit? And then you have advocacy organizations that might represent the public that are kind of trying to keep relevant as well. So yeah, it's a bit of I think we are at a transition point. And again, the backdrop is a drastically changing resource status on some of our really important species like moose, caribou, salmon, fish, trapping, all kinds of things. It's all changing right now. So a bit of an all over the place answer, but certainly something that is top of mind. And, as long as we do our best, we listen, we try to be strategic, and, that's all we can do, I guess.
Yeah, and I like where you were going there at one point, because I wanted to follow up and say, well, what's the solution? to this to maintain relevance and to provide value as co-management boards. And you touched on different things, but I don't know if there was anything that you wanted to elaborate on in that area, and sort of ideas that you may have on what you see as strategic actions or thoughts that would be valuable for not only the First Nations, but us as practitioners and for the salmon ultimately in this case also.
Yeah, I think, and this is hard for me because I'm diplomatic by nature, so I try to listen to everyone and really try to find that common ground. But I think we need to listen to each other more. Like there's a lot of talking, not a lot of listening, and I can I've been in rooms where there's 3 or 4 of us saying things. We think we agree, but we leave that room. I don't think we've really agreed. So we need to kind of listen more. We need to lean into more difficult conversations. We need to think longer term, beyond political cycles. I think we do need to collaborate in the truest sense, which means some power sharing, which means some people have to give up some power, some organizations, some governments, or we just have to know our place. We don't have to be at every part, we don't have to be invited to every party, but we can still support. So, I think of like the rebuilding strategy. The Chinook rebuilding strategy should have a place for everyone to participate and move forward, either in a particular strategic initiative or action, or supporting through whatever means, right? Beaver dam removals. Like a beaver dam removal in a traditional territory isn't going to solve the Chinook crisis, but there's a heck of a lot of benefits to that. So let's celebrate that. Let's bring that in. Maybe we can amplify that. So amplifying successes, leaning into difficult conversations, giving up a little bit of power, listening more. And I also will say, this whole concept of funding, right? Where we're as a co-management board, funding's always, we're all struggling, right? We'd all like infinite amount of resources. It doesn't exist. But we know like DFO put $647 million into the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, right? So, we want to make sure that there are some resources on the table that are aligned with our various interests. And I guess what are salmon worth? We're seeing right now with our Yukon Energy, with our dam water relicensing, which is happening right now, there's a hydro dam that's a big part of our electrical grid in the Yukon. We need hydro. But the question is, how much are salmon worth? Because there's issues with fish passage, upstream and downstream. So relative to utility rates, keeping those low, and relative to maintaining fish, downstream and upstream of the dam, what is that worth? So we need to have these conversations. And I would argue, without fish, wildlife, and habitat, we're going to lose a big part of what it means to be northern peoples living on the northern landscape and everything that comes with it. So, yeah, just keep advocating where we advocate. I mean, again, it's all over the place, but it's a holistic approach. And when we need to be specific, we need to be specific. But when not, we just need to acknowledge that everyone relates to these fisheries and these resources in different ways.
No, I think that's an excellent answer and probably a good way to wrap up our time together today. I really enjoyed meeting you in this conversation and appreciate you taking the time. And by doing this on this podcast, it gives us an opportunity to educate other Canadians about co-management writ large, but specifically about what you're doing in the Yukon. And if there's ever any specific initiative or thing that you'd like to drill down on or talk again, I'd be happy to meet again, record another one. And by all means, I hope we can stay in touch and our paths will cross, I'm sure, now that we've met this way.
Yeah, no, I feel exactly the same way. Thanks so much. And I appreciate you bringing forward this variety across Canada, because these lessons learned, we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. So if something's working somewhere, let's get behind it and give it a try. And worst case is we get it wrong and we go a different direction, but at least we're doing something.
Exactly.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks so much.
You take care.
Thank you for listening to the full podcast. Please like the podcast, subscribe, and leave comments so we can connect. If you are interested in joining a dedicated Indigenous community of practice with many of Canada's leading practitioners and thinkers in this area, you can skip over and visit our website at www.co-management.ca. Getting signed up is easy, and professional development is a tangible and effective way to show your commitment to reconciliation.